You know that moment when your phone buzzes with a notification and you see numbers that don't even seem real? 89 million views. That's what happened when I posted a simple TikTok video about my family blocking me on every single platform after I refused to hand over my inheritance. What started as me venting to strangers on the internet became the most viral expose of family dysfunction anyone had ever seen. But let me tell you, those 89 million people who watched my video, they only saw the tip of the iceberg. The real story goes so much deeper, and it's time I told the whole truth about what my family really did to me. I'm sitting here now in my apartment in Denver, looking at my phone screen, showing all those blocked contact attempts, and I can't help but laugh. Not because it's funny, but because it took me 28 years to realize that being blocked by toxic people isn't punishment, it's freedom. My name is Sarah, and for most of my life, I believed that family meant everything, that blood was thicker than water, and that keeping the peace was worth sacrificing my own happiness. I was wrong about all of that, and the lesson cost me nearly 3 decades of my life. But sometimes the most expensive lessons are the most valuable ones, and boy, did I learn some things about my family that I never saw coming. The story really begins 6 months ago, when my grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 92. Grandma Rose had been the glue holding our fractured family together for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of woman who made Sunday dinners mandatory, who remembered everyone's birthday without writing it down, and who somehow managed to love each of us unconditionally despite our many, many flaws. I was her favorite grandchild, not because she played favorites, but because I was the only one who visited her every week, helped her with groceries, and actually listened when she told her stories about growing up during the Great Depression. While my cousins and siblings were busy with their own lives, I was the one holding her hand during doctor's appointments and making sure she took her medications. When the family gathered for Grandma Rose's funeral, I noticed something strange in how everyone was acting around me. There were whispered conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms, meaningful glances exchanged between my mother and my Aunt Linda, and an overall tension that seemed to have nothing to do with grief. My older brother Marcus, who had barely spoken to me in years, suddenly wanted to have long conversations about family responsibilities and what Grandma would have wanted. My cousin Jennifer, who had always treated me like I was invisible at family gatherings, kept asking about my job as a graphic designer and whether I was financially stable these days. It felt like they were all circling around something, waiting for the right moment to pounce, but I couldn't figure out what it was. The reading of the will took place 3 days after the funeral in a law office downtown. I remember walking into that sterile conference room with its mahogany table and thinking this was just a formality, that Grandma probably left each of us some small keepsake to remember her by. I expected maybe her recipe box, or perhaps her collection of vintage brooches that I had always admired. What I didn't expect was for the lawyer to clear his throat and announce that Rose Margaret Coleman had left me, Sarah Coleman, her youngest granddaughter, the entirety of her estate, including her house, her savings account, her investment portfolio, and her life insurance policy. The total value? Just over $450,000. You could have heard a pin drop in that room as everyone processed what they had just heard. The silence lasted maybe 10 seconds before all hell broke loose. My mother shot to her feet so fast her chair nearly tipped over, her face turning that particular shade of red that I remembered from childhood tantrums. "This has to be a mistake," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Mother was 92. She wasn't thinking clearly. Sarah must have influenced her somehow. My Aunt Linda nodded vigorously, already pulling out her phone like she was going to call someone to fix this perceived injustice. Marcus just stared at me with an expression I had never seen before, pure, undiluted hatred mixed with something that looked almost like fear. My cousin Jennifer started crying, but not the kind of tears you shed for a beloved grandmother. These were angry tears, frustrated tears, the kind you cry when something you thought belonged to you gets taken away. The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, had clearly dealt with situations like this before because he calmly explained that Mrs. Coleman had updated her will just 6 months earlier, that she had been of sound mind and body when she made the changes, and that she had specifically requested that the will be read exactly as written with no modifications or challenges. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Grandma's familiar handwriting and told me it was a personal letter she had left for me. As I sat there holding that envelope, watching my family argue with the lawyer about contesting the will and demanding psychological evaluations and throwing around words like undue influence, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my relationships with these people was about to change forever. The grandmother who had loved me unconditionally had just given me the greatest gift imaginable, and in doing so, she had accidentally shown me who my family really was when money was involved. I didn't open Grandma's letter until I got home that night, and when I did, I cried for 2 hours straight. She had written it in her shaky handwriting, but every word was clear and deliberate. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then you know what I've done, and you're probably wondering why. The truth is, I've been watching this family for 92 years, and I've seen how they treat the people they're supposed to love. I've watched your mother criticize every choice you've made since you were old enough to make choices. I've seen your brother dismiss your dreams like they don't matter. I've watched your cousins treat you like you're somehow less than them because you chose art over money, because you chose kindness over status." She went on to explain that she had been saving money her entire life, living modestly so she could leave something meaningful to the person who had shown her the most genuine love and care. "You were the only one who visited me because you wanted to, not because you felt obligated to," she wrote. "You were the only one who asked about my stories, who helped me feel like I still mattered in this world." The phone calls started the very next morning. First my mother, then Marcus, then Aunt Linda, then Jennifer, and finally even some cousins I hadn't heard from in years. They all had the same basic message wrapped in slightly different packaging. I needed to do the right thing and share the inheritance with the family. My mother's approach was emotional manipulation at its finest. She called me sobbing, saying that Grandma had obviously been confused in her final months, that she never would have wanted to tear the family apart like this, and that as her daughter, she deserved at least half of everything. "Sarah, honey, you know I'm struggling since your father and I divorced," she said, her voice cracking with practiced emotion. "I've been working 2 jobs just to keep the house, and you know how much that house means to me. It's where you grew up, where all our memories are. Surely you don't want to see your own mother lose her childhood home because you're being selfish with money that should be shared among all of us." Marcus took a different approach entirely. He came to my apartment unannounced on a Tuesday evening, wearing his expensive suit and carrying his leather briefcase like he was conducting a business meeting. He sat at my kitchen table and spread out papers and charts, showing me investment opportunities and tax implications and explaining how I was financially naive if I thought I could handle this kind of money on my own. "Sarah, you've never managed anything more complex than a checking account," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is serious money, and serious money requires serious expertise. I've been managing investment portfolios for 8 years now. I know what Grandma would want. She'd want this money to grow, to benefit the whole family for generations to come. If you try to handle this yourself, you'll probably lose half of it to taxes and poor decisions within a year." He had brought contracts with him, documents that would essentially make him the manager of our inheritance, with him taking a substantial fee for his professional services. Aunt Linda's strategy was pure guilt and family loyalty. She invited me to lunch at our old family restaurant, the place where we used to celebrate birthdays and graduations, and spent 2 hours telling me stories about how close she and Grandma had been. How she had been the one to take care of Grandma during her early 70s when she had that minor stroke. How she had sacrificed her own career to be available for family emergencies. Your grandmother always said that family comes first, Sarah, she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand with her perfectly manicured fingers. She raised us to believe that what benefits one of us should benefit all of us. You know, she never would have wanted to create division and resentment among the people she loved most. I think what she really wanted was for the family to work together to decide how to handle this gift she's given us. After all, you're still young, you don't have children to think about, you don't have the same responsibilities that some of us have. This money could really change lives for people who need it more urgently than you do. Jennifer's approach was the most transparent and, honestly, the most insulting. She showed up at my workplace, apparently having looked up the address of the design firm where I freelance, and cornered me in the lobby during my lunch break. She was dressed in her usual designer clothes, carrying a purse that probably cost more than my rent, and she didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Look, Sarah, let's just cut to the chase," she said, checking her phone while she talked like this conversation was an inconvenience she needed to get through quickly. "Everyone knows you're going to share the money anyway, because that's what decent people do when they inherit something this big unexpectedly. The question is whether you're going to do it gracefully and maintain your relationships with your family, or whether you're going to drag this out and make everyone resent you for being difficult. I've already talked to a lawyer about contesting the will, and honestly, we have a pretty strong case. Grandma was old, she was probably lonely, and you were the only one who visited regularly. It wouldn't be hard to prove that you manipulated an elderly woman into changing her will in your favor." But the real turning point came when I overheard a phone conversation I was never supposed to hear. I had gone to my mother's house to pick up some of Grandma's photo albums that she said she had set aside for me, and I was waiting in the living room while she went upstairs to get them. She must have forgotten I was there because she answered a call from Marcus, and I could hear both sides of the conversation through the thin walls of her old house. "She's being completely unreasonable," my mother was saying, her voice taking on a sharp edge I recognized from my childhood. "I raised that girl, I sacrificed everything for her, and this is how she repays me? By keeping money that should rightfully be shared with the family." Marcus's voice was harder to make out, but I caught enough words to understand that they were discussing legal options, ways to pressure me, and backup plans if I continued to refuse their demands. The part that really broke my heart was when my mother said, "Well, if she wants to be selfish and destroy this family over money, then maybe it's time she learned what it feels like to be truly alone." Some people only learn lessons the hard way. That conversation changed everything for me because it revealed something I had been trying not to see. This wasn't about grief or family values or even really about the money itself. This was about control, about power, about a family dynamic where I was expected to be grateful for scraps and never question why I was always the one asked to sacrifice for everyone else's benefit. I started thinking back over the years, remembering all the times I had been asked to be understanding when someone couldn't make it to my art shows, all the times my achievements had been minimized or dismissed, all the times I had been expected to be the peacekeeper who absorbed everyone else's dysfunction without complaint. I remembered family dinners where my career was treated like a cute hobby while Marcus's business dealings were discussed with reverence and respect. I remembered birthday parties where my gifts were always the smallest, Christmas mornings where I was expected to be grateful for practical presents while my cousins received expensive electronics and jewelry. I remembered being told I was too sensitive when I pointed out unfair treatment, being accused of stirring up drama when I tried to stand up for myself. The final straw came during Thanksgiving dinner, just 2 weeks after the will reading. I had decided to attend despite everything, hoping that maybe we could find a way to move forward as a family. Instead, I walked into what was clearly a planned intervention. Everyone was there: my mother, Marcus, Aunt Linda, Jennifer, even some extended family members I barely knew, and they had obviously coordinated their approach. They spent the entire meal taking turns making comments about family responsibility and sharing blessings and what Grandma would have really wanted. When I tried to change the subject, they brought it right back to the inheritance. When I tried to leave early, they blocked my path and insisted we needed to resolve this as a family. The breaking point came when Marcus stood up and announced that they had all agreed to give me one more week to come to your senses and do the right thing, and if I didn't agree to share the inheritance by the following Friday, they would have no choice but to take legal action and cut me out of the family entirely. The room fell silent as everyone stared at me, waiting for my response, and I realized that this was it. This was the moment where I either surrendered to their manipulation or finally stood up for myself after 28 years of being treated like a second-class family member. I stood up from that Thanksgiving table, looked around the room at all those faces staring at me with expectation and barely concealed hostility, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt something click into place inside me. It was like a switch had been flipped, and suddenly I could see the situation with perfect clarity. These people weren't my family in any meaningful sense of the word. They were strangers who happened to share my DNA and who had spent decades conditioning me to believe that their comfort was more important than my dignity. I picked up my purse, looked directly at Marcus, and said 5 words that would change everything. Go ahead. Take legal action. The silence that followed was deafening, and I could see the shock on their faces as they realized that their ultimatum had backfired completely. They had expected me to crumble under pressure like I always had before, but instead, I had called their bluff. Walking out of that house felt like shedding a skin I had outgrown years ago but had been too afraid to leave behind. I drove home in complete silence, not even turning on the radio, just processing the magnitude of what had just happened. When I got to my apartment, I sat down at my computer and did something I had never done before. I researched my legal rights. I spent hours reading about inheritance law, about what constitutes undue influence, about the burden of proof required to contest a will. What I discovered was both enlightening and infuriating. My family's threats were largely empty. Contesting Grandma's will would be expensive, time-consuming, and extremely difficult to win, especially since she had been evaluated by her doctor just weeks before making the changes and had been declared mentally competent. They were banking on my ignorance and my fear of confrontation to get what they wanted without having to actually follow through on their legal threats. The silence started immediately. By the weekend after Thanksgiving, I realized that none of them had called, texted, or reached out in any way. At first, I thought maybe they were giving me space to reconsider my decision, but as days turned into weeks, it became clear that this was their new strategy: complete social isolation. They had blocked me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and even LinkedIn. When I tried calling my mother, the call went straight to voicemail, and she never called back. Marcus had blocked my number entirely. Even cousins I had barely spoken to at the dinner had apparently been instructed to cut off all contact with me. It was like I had been erased from the family entirely, like 28 years of shared history had been deleted with the click of a button. The isolation campaign extended beyond just social media and phone calls. I found out through a mutual friend that my mother had organized a family meeting without me, where they had all agreed to pretend I didn't exist until I came to my senses. Christmas invitations that I had received for years suddenly stopped coming. Family photos were being posted on social media that conspicuously excluded me. Even old photos that I had been in were cropped or edited to remove me entirely. My cousin Jennifer had even gone so far as to create a family group chat called Real Family Only that included everyone except me. The message was clear: conform to their demands, or cease to exist in their world. But here's the thing about being isolated by toxic people. Once you get past the initial hurt and shock, you start to realize how much more peaceful your life becomes. I wasn't getting calls from my mother criticizing my latest art project or questioning my life choices. I wasn't being dragged into Marcus's endless drama about his business ventures or his relationship problems. I wasn't being used as a free therapist for Jennifer's complaints about her marriage or her job. For the first time in years, my phone wasn't constantly buzzing with demands for my time, attention, or emotional labor. I was finally free to focus on my own life, my own goals, my own happiness, without having to consider how every decision would affect people who had never shown the same consideration for me. The turning point came in February, about 3 months after they had cut me off completely. I was having coffee with my best friend Maya, who had been watching this whole situation unfold with a mixture of concern and barely restrained anger on my behalf. Maya had never liked my family, and she had been telling me for years that they treated me poorly, but I had always defended them because that's what you're supposed to do with family, right? That day, she looked at me across the table and said something that changed my entire perspective. "Sarah, you've been happier these past 3 months than I've seen you in the 5 years I've known you. You're sleeping better, you're more creative, you're not constantly stressed about family drama. Maybe being cut off from them isn't the punishment they think it is. Maybe it's the gift you never knew you needed." That conversation got me thinking about something I had never considered before. What if I told my story publicly? What if I shared what had really happened, not for revenge, but for the people out there who might be going through something similar? I had been reading articles online about family estrangement, about toxic family dynamics, about inheritance disputes, and I kept seeing the same comments over and over again. I thought I was the only one going through this, and I felt so alone until I read this. And thank you for sharing your story. It helped me realize I'm not crazy. I started to think that maybe my experience could help someone else who was trapped in a similar situation, someone who was being manipulated and gaslit by people who were supposed to love them unconditionally. I created the TikTok account on a whim, really. I was scrolling through the app one evening, watching other people share their family drama stories, and I thought, why not? What's the worst that could happen? They've already cut me out of their lives completely. I set up the account under a username that didn't include my real name, and I made my first video sitting in my living room with my phone propped up against a stack of books. I didn't script it or rehearse it. I just started talking, telling the story of how my family had blocked me on everything after I refused to share my inheritance. I talked about the manipulation, the guilt trips, the ultimatums, and the complete social exile that followed my refusal to comply with their demands. I ended the video by saying, if you're going through something similar, you're not alone and you're not crazy. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who love you with the most conditions of all. I posted that first video at around 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and then I went to bed without thinking much about it. When I woke up the next morning, my phone was buzzing nonstop with notifications. The video had gotten over 50,000 views overnight, with thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories of family manipulation and inheritance disputes. But what really shocked me was how many people were asking for more details, wanting to know what happened next, encouraging me to share the whole story. I had expected maybe a few dozen views and a couple of supportive comments, but this response was overwhelming. People were saying things like, "Please make a part 2, and I need to know how this ends, and your family sounds exactly like mine." I realized I had tapped into something much bigger than my own personal situation. I had given voice to an experience that thousands of people were living through in silence. Over the next few weeks, I posted a series of videos detailing everything that had happened, from the will reading to the family interventions to the complete social isolation. Each video got more views than the last, and the comments section became a support group for people dealing with toxic families. But it was my 7th video that really went viral, the one where I shared some of the actual text messages I had saved from my family members before they blocked me. I had screenshots of my mother saying things like, "You're destroying this family over greed," and Marcus writing, "Dad would be ashamed of the person you've become if he were still alive." I showed Jennifer's message where she said, "Don't expect us to be there for you when you realize you've made the biggest mistake of your life." Reading those messages out loud, with the benefit of months of distance and therapy, I could hear the manipulation and emotional abuse so clearly that it was almost laughable. The comments on that video were intense. People were outraged on my behalf, sharing their own screenshots of similar messages from family members and creating a community of support that I had never experienced before. But what I didn't expect was for the video to reach people who actually knew my family. I started getting messages from people in my hometown, from former classmates, even from some of my mother's coworkers. They were sharing stories about things they had witnessed over the years, how my mother talked about me at work, how Marcus had always seemed jealous of any attention I received, how Jennifer had made snide comments about me at social gatherings. One message particularly stood out. It was from a woman who had worked with my mother for 15 years, and she said, "I always wondered why your mom complained about you so much when you seemed like such a sweet girl. Now I understand. She was always jealous that you were your grandmother's favorite." By the time my story reached 10 million views, something unexpected started happening. My family began to feel the social pressure. Apparently, people in our small town had started recognizing the story and connecting it back to them. My mother's book club had seen the videos, Marcus's business partners were asking questions, and Jennifer's neighbors were giving her strange looks at the grocery store. I found out later that several people had actually approached my mother at work to ask if she was the person in that viral TikTok story about the inheritance. The anonymous nature of my account hadn't protected them as much as they thought it would, because apparently I had included enough specific details that people who knew us could piece it together. The breaking point came when my story hit 50 million views and started getting picked up by other social media platforms. Someone had screen recorded all my videos and posted them on YouTube as a compilation, which got another 20 million views. Instagram accounts were sharing screenshots of my story, and it was being discussed on Reddit threads about family drama and inheritance disputes. At that point, it wasn't just people in our hometown who were recognizing the story. It was becoming a nationwide conversation about toxic family dynamics and financial manipulation. I started getting messages from local news stations wanting to interview me, from podcasters asking if I'd share my story on their shows, and from people asking if I was planning to write a book about my experience. The first crack in my family's united front came from an unexpected source. My youngest cousin Rebecca, who was only 16 and had been too young to be included in most of the family machinations. She managed to find my account and sent me a direct message that made me cry. "Sarah, I don't understand why everyone is so mad at you. Grandma Rose always said you were the kindest person in our family, and she used to tell me that you were the only one who visited her because you actually cared, not because you felt guilty. I miss you, and I think what they're doing is wrong. I hope you know that not everyone in the family agrees with how you're being treated." That message reminded me that there were innocent people caught in the middle of this mess, people who weren't part of the manipulation but were being forced to choose sides in a conflict they didn't understand. But the real moment of reckoning came when my story reached 80 million views and something I had never anticipated happened. My family started facing real-world consequences for their behavior. Marcus's business reputation began to suffer when clients started associating him with the story of financial manipulation and family greed. Jennifer's social circle began to distance themselves from her after recognizing her in the story about emotional blackmail and inheritance disputes. My mother started getting negative comments on her own social media posts from strangers who had connected her to the viral story. They had thought that cutting me off would be consequence-free for them, that they could manipulate me into compliance through isolation and guilt. Instead, their behavior was being examined and judged by millions of people around the world. The final straw that broke their resolve came when the story reached 89 million views and my mother's employer started asking questions. Apparently, several of her coworkers had recognized the story and were making comments about her character and fitness to work in a position of trust. Her supervisor called her in for a meeting to discuss concerns about her personal conduct and how it might reflect on the company. That same week, Marcus lost a major client who said they didn't want to do business with someone involved in that kind of family drama. And Jennifer's husband started getting questions from his own family about whether the stories his wife's cousin was telling online were true. Suddenly, the consequences of their actions weren't abstract or delayed. They were immediate, personal, and affecting the parts of their lives they cared about most: their money, their reputations, and their social standing. That's when the messages started coming. Not apologies, mind you, but panicked attempts at damage control. My mother sent me an email through a mutual friend asking me to please take down those videos before you destroy what's left of this family. Marcus had his lawyer send me a cease and desist letter demanding I stop defaming him online, apparently not understanding that truth isn't defamation. Jennifer tried to get mutual friends to intervene, asking them to convince me to delete my account for the good of everyone involved. But by then, it was too late. The story had taken on a life of its own, and even if I wanted to, I couldn't control where it went from there. People had already downloaded the videos, shared them on other platforms, and turned my personal experience into a cultural touchstone for discussions about toxic families and financial manipulation. The most satisfying moment came when I posted my final video in the series, the one that would push the view count to exactly 89 million. In that video, I didn't talk about my family at all. Instead, I talked about the thousands of messages I had received from people thanking me for sharing my story, telling me how it had helped them recognize their own toxic family situations, how it had given them the courage to set boundaries, how it had made them feel less alone in their struggles. I read some of the most powerful messages I had received from people who had been financially abused by family members, who had been manipulated through guilt and obligation, who had been made to feel crazy for standing up for themselves. I realized that what had started as me venting about my personal situation had become something much bigger, a catalyst for conversations that needed to happen, a mirror that forced people to examine their own family dynamics, and a source of support for people who had been suffering in silence. As I sit here now, 6 months after posting that first video, I can honestly say that being blocked by my toxic family was the best thing that ever happened to me. I used part of my inheritance to start my own graphic design business, something I never would have had the confidence to do when I was constantly being told I wasn't capable of managing money or making good decisions. I've built a community of genuinely supportive people through my online platform, people who care about me as a person rather than what I can do for them. I've learned to trust my own judgment, to set boundaries, and to recognize manipulation when I see it. Most importantly, I've learned that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love, respect, and mutual support. The people who tried to manipulate me into giving up my inheritance taught me the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to treat you with basic human dignity. And sometimes, sharing your truth with the world is the only way to break free from the lies that have been controlling your life.